Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Sarah Ludlow and Cameron Wood, with PCAP's partner, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, will be talking about songbird conservation efforts and the Qu'Appelle Valley as a focal area for conservation. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Check out the PCAP website for more information about our upcoming Native Prairie Speaker Series. Join us on October 9th, 2018 at noon for a talk about pathogens on the prairies, assessing health of native Saskatchewan bumblebees. And this presentation will be given by Kirsten Palmier, Masters of Science student at the University of Regina. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by TransCanada Corporation, Canada North Environmental Services, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Eco-Friendly Sask, Information Services Corporation, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance Inc., SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it at any time during the question section of the webinar dashboard, and questions will be answered by our speakers at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about our speakers. Sarah Ludlow is a Conservation Science Coordinator, GIS, with the Nature Conservancy of Canada in Saskatchewan, and she has been with NCC for 3 years. Prior to NCC, Sarah worked for the Canadian Wildlife Service and Parks Canada. She has a master's degree in biology from the University of Regina. Cameron Wood is a Program Director for Nature Conservancy of Canada in Saskatchewan. In this role, he oversees the acquisition of new properties and conservation easements, as well as the ongoing stewardship of those properties. Cameron completed his post-secondary education at Lethbridge College and Royal Roads University. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters today.
Hi, Caitlin. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Can you see our screen?
Yeah, it looks like it's in presenter mode. Can you switch that?
I will try. Is that better?
Yes, that's it. Perfect.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to do our presentation in 2 parts. I will start with the songbird conservation efforts, and then Cameron's going to talk about the Qu'Appelle Valley. So why birds? That's a question that I'm often asked, as I chose to do my graduate work on birds, and have also spent a large amount of time and effort on other bird projects and conservation efforts. So reason number 1, birds are diverse. And my screen is not corrected. There we go. Almost every ecosystem and habitat on Earth, and they're often an integral component of the healthy functioning of the systems in which they occur. As a result, birds are often very good indicators of ecosystem health, and if the bird population is doing poorly, it is a really good sign that there's probably a broader problem or issue occurring in that ecosystem. And finally, let's be honest, birds are just super cool. So now that we've established that, that birds are both super cool and a great taxa to use to help us understand the natural world, let's talk about birds in NCC. So the Nature Conservancy of Canada is a science-based organization, and it's therefore committed to partnering with researchers and, when possible, doing research of its own. So one of the main ways that NCC contributes to bird conservation is through habitat preservation. So there's so many species where habitat loss is listed as one of the primary drivers of their declines in populations. And so conservation of land by NCC is a direct way that these losses can be combated. So in addition to just protecting habitat, NCC Saskatchewan has a few different projects underway to help the birds as well. So the first project I will discuss is Big Valley Maps. So this past summer, NCC Saskatchewan established a map station at the Big Valley property. And this is located near Craven in the Qu'Appelle Valley. So the Big Valley Map Station is the first of its kind for NCC Saskatchewan, and it's the 4th active map station in the province. So what is MAP? MAP stands for Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship. During the summer nesting season, the MAPS program uses bird banding techniques to capture birds and record information related to their age, sex, body condition, and reproductive status. The MAPS program began in 1989, and it runs surveys annually across the United States and Canada. And there are over 300 active MAP stations in Canada and the US. So since they use standardized protocols, the data produced from the MAPS program are long-term, wide-ranging, and robust. And this makes it really valuable for answering large-scale questions related to avian demographics and population trends. So you often hear about all these bird populations that are declining. Well, monitoring bird demographic rates is one way to understand the mechanisms that are driving these declines. And once we understand that, then we can actually do something to stop them. So bird banding involves passively capturing birds, usually with a fine mesh net, placed in a habitat with lots of bird activity. So captured birds are fitted with a uniquely numbered, lightweight aluminum leg band. It's like a little bracelet. And we record the information about every bird's age, sex, body condition, and reproductive status. Once all the data is recorded, the bird is released unharmed. MAPS protocol dictates that the nets open at sunrise and remain open for 6 hours. And the nets are checked approximately every half an hour, and any captured birds are removed at that time. And we make a concerted effort to ensure that the birds are in captivity for as little time as possible. We want to minimize the stress to them and have them on their ways as quickly as we can. So at Big Valley, we have 8 nets, and they are set up in a circuitous route, as you can see on this map. So when we do a net run to check the nets, we start at net number 1, and then we go in numerical order through to net number 8, and then we take the birds back to the banding base to process them. So when we take the birds out of net 1, they come with us all the way as we do the rest of the run, and then we take them back to the banding base. So we take the birds out of the net, we put them into a little cotton bag, so they're nice and comfortable and stress-free, and then we get them back and process them as quickly as we can. So this summer, over the course of the MAP season, which runs from June 10th to August 8th in Saskatchewan, we had 168 newly banded birds of 22 different species, and we recaptured 38 birds of 8 different species. So the top 5 most common species we captured and banded were yellow warblers, house wrens, black activities, and American red stars. The six species, which I didn't list here, was leaf flycatchers. So pretty good. Really excited for next season. This is an ongoing project, and hopefully we'll catch many more birds. The second project I'll talk about is long-term monitoring of the grassland birds on our Old Man's Back, Wideview, and Hole-in-the-Wall properties. Grassland bird populations have declined significantly over the last century, largely due to anthropogenic habitat loss and fragmentation. Long-term monitoring of bird abundance will provide us with a better picture of the grassland bird community that is present on these properties, as well as how the grassland bird community responds to management or changes in management actions. Improved understanding of the grassland bird community will allow NCC to make management decisions that benefit the grassland bird community and conservation of that community. The project is in its early stages, so 2018 marks the second year of surveys at OMB and Wideview, and the first year of surveys at Hole-in-the-Wall. Hole-in-the-Wall, we just acquired that, so this is the first year we could do surveys there, so yeah, that's exciting. The birds are surveyed using point counts, and these are distributed across the whole property. And the goal is to complete these surveys annually and amass a long-term data set of bird abundance on each property. So this is another ongoing project. The third project I will talk about is nest boxes. This past spring, we installed 14 nest boxes on our Edenwold property, which is located near Edenwold, which is northeast of Regina. These boxes are designed for tree swallows and mountain bluebirds specifically. So I went out about 2 weeks after we installed the boxes, and we already had 9 of the 14 boxes with activity at them. which doesn't sound maybe very impressive, but that's actually really cool. So what that means is that the birds had found and started using the boxes way faster than it was expected. So that was surprising, but in a good way. Most of the boxes were occupied by tree swallows, and a couple were in use by house robins. So no bluebirds, but hopefully next year. So we were fortunate to have an awesome volunteer that made and donated all these boxes, and they'd all turned out really well. So you can see in this picture that it's nice and sturdy, and that one is occupied by a tree swallow. So he plans to make us some additional boxes, which we will put up at a different property next spring. We'll do this as part of a volunteer event, and if this is something that you're interested in, you can check our event website, conservationvolunteers.ca, for postings about that, and yeah, come out and help us. That would be great. So the final project I'm going to talk about is the Saskatchewan Breeding Bird Atlas. So NCC is a partner on the Atlas, which is a 5-year project that aims to map the distribution and abundance of breeding birds across the province. So this is a 5-year project, as I said. So this is actually the end of year 2. So there's still 3 years left. And the Atlas project is administered by Biodiversity Canada, with the majority of work done by volunteers. This project is a really great way for everybody to make a solid and tangible contribution to the conservation of birds in your own backyard and across the province. All levels of experience are able to participate, and all observations are valuable. I cannot stress enough how cool it is that we have this project happening in Saskatchewan. And when you say all levels of experience can participate, really all levels of experience can participate. If you can identify a robin and a chickadee, you are qualified to participate. You don't need to be a scientist with years and years of experience. You need to be able to just confidently know that, yes, that is a robin, and you could enter that. And you'd be surprised at how many holes there are across the province where there's really common species that just aren't recorded there. So every observation is valuable, and we have 3 years left, so let's fill in all those holes. So if you are interested in signing up or getting some more information, you can go to the Bird Atlas website, which is sas.birdatlas.ca. And yeah, so if you have any further questions about these projects, you can ask at the end of the presentation, or you can email me. I provided that there. These projects are mostly all ongoing, and if you're interested in getting updates or as they're happening in the summer, you can follow me on social media. I provided my Instagram and Twitter handle on screen, and I'll be providing updates on those projects as I go. So I'm going to turn it over to Cameron now, and he's going to talk about Qu'Appelle Valley stuff.
Thanks, Sarah. My expertise on any particular topic is nowhere near as deep as Sarah's is on birds. So I'm going to zoom out in context a little bit, but talk about one geographic location in a little bit more detail, and kind of why and how we kind of tackle some of our work in that area. So I'm going to talk to you guys about the Qu'Appelle River Valley, as well as I'm going to lump in some of the tributaries and things that feed into that valley, and why we focus so much of our conservation efforts on that area. Some of our recent property acquisitions got quite a bit of media attention, so it kind of brought this topic into light, and ties in very well with grassland birds because of its significance for conservation in the province. So just to give context in case somebody doesn't know exactly what I'm talking about and exactly where the Qu'Appelle River Valley is, it runs eastward across southern Saskatchewan from Lake Diefenbaker. So right here is kind of the headwaters of the Qu'Appelle River, and runs in an eastward way across the province and into southwest Manitoba. And it's a glacial valley, a glacial valley, and the tablelands above the valley are incredibly flat. Same glaciation effects there, which has provided some of the threats that exist on the landscape in terms of its opportunities. So like I said, I'm going to kind of include some of the tributaries, and I'm going to lump Last Mountain Lake in here as well when I'm thinking about the Qu'Appelle River Valley, at least in the context of this discussion. So here's just kind of a quick outline of the exact area that I'm kind of talking about, and I'll have that little outline in some other maps as well. The Qu'Appelle River Valley is important for a number of reasons. It's one of our last areas of intact remaining native habitats. About 25% of the province's population actually gets their drinking water from the valley, mostly being pulled out of Buffalo Pound Lake. So that's quite significant in terms of how that area is managed and what the impact is on our water source. Also a key area of connectivity for habitat, and it's got a variety of uses, everything from agriculture, recreation, residential development, and it's also very picturesque and kind of stands in contrast to what the stereotype of Saskatchewan is of being flat and boring. It's quite rolling. When you get going up those hills, it's pretty steep, you realize, and very pretty. So as Sarah mentioned, habitat loss is one of the main issues for grassland birds in the province, and as well as more broadly. And in Saskatchewan, we have less than 20% of our native prairie left. And if we look at this map here, that tan color that covers most of this area is what's already been cultivated. So it's either in annual agriculture or some of it might be tame grass that could quite easily be converted into annual agriculture. Those greenish colors that you see little blobs of here and there, that's what's left for native grassland. And this is an out-of-date data set from 2001. It's one of the most complete data sets, but it is old. So there's would even be less than what's showing here. And if you look closely, it's a little hard to tell at this scale. But those green areas right along the Qu'Appelle River Valley are more or less intact. So, you know, it's a really important confluence of that native habitat, and it stretches right across, you know, the eastern half of the province in the south, and it actually ties in very well with the South Saskatchewan River on the other side of Lake Diefenbaker, which is out of the frame here. So that connectivity is very important. And just before I started at NCC, we actually had some connectivity analysis done with the best data sets available, and this map is one of the resulting products of that. And all of those dark and light green areas are either core blocks of habitat or pieces of connected habitat. And again, as you can see here, that whole entire river valley as a piece of connective tissue across the landscape, so to speak, is incredibly vital, and it actually ties in with some of those north-south areas of connectivity as well that connect to other areas of habitat. These movement corridors are incredibly important for wildlife that move across the landscape, or even for, you know, species like grasses and forbs, where having relatively contiguous areas to have seed disperse and intermingling of populations at a much slower pace is very important. And that importance is that much higher in the light of climate change and thinking about the value of corridors as resilient, adding resiliency to the landscape in light of that threat. So thinking about the approach we take within the valley here, as well as to our conservation planning more broadly, and I won't get into too much detail on that planning process, but one of the first things that we do is considering the targets for conservation in that particular area. And here along the Qu'Appelle River Valley, it's very important for the existing native habitat and that connectivity. As far as species at risk that should be present within those areas, it's kind of the last remaining refuge for them in a lot of ways, at least within that portion of the province. And it does serve as very important for grassland birds because beyond the borders of the valley, there's very little of that habitat left within that part of Saskatchewan, and really only in the extreme southwest where you have broad expanses. So maintaining this area, especially those tablelands just up above the valley that are so nice and flat and so susceptible to some of the threats of habitat conversion, is very important. We also are targeting and looking for opportunities for restoration, and where we focus those efforts is really on looking at connecting the dots on the landscape. Restoration as an island doesn't serve much purpose in the broader picture of things, but if we can kind of take some of those areas that largely have connectivity, but there's a little bit of a gap in between, and we look at those areas for restoration and being able to improve the resiliency of our native species against climate change and improving the flow of species across the landscape, that's really vital. And the other side of the coin here is looking at the threats to biodiversity. Obviously, these vary depending on where you are and that sort of thing, but habitat conversion and that loss of habitat is still one of our absolute top threats for biodiversity, and it continues to occur on the landscape. Within this area, there's a lot of pressures for industrial developments, especially some of the mining resources, gravel extraction, that sort of thing. But recreational development, especially in cottage country and the lower reaches of the Qu'Appelle, is also adding a lot of pressures to this landscape. Invasive species, like the rest of the province, are a growing concern. We have leafy spurge in the valley. We've got other invasive species, and some of those agronomic grass species like Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome that are really challenging to manage and are kind of taking over some of the niche elements of our native species and really kind of reducing the overall diversity. So that's a major threat to biodiversity in this area, especially when we consider those habitat uses or land uses that are beyond the core part of the valley itself, and looking at the opportunities and vectors for transmission of those species. I already mentioned kind of the gravel extraction, which is, I think, a growing threat within this area. And wetland drainage and alteration of flow, something a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the water that comes down the Qu'Appelle River in a totally natural environment never would have been there in the first place. It's actually diverted from the South Saskatchewan River for the purpose of drinking water and other things, to be able to have a consistent, reliable flow. And the actual river itself and the banks and riparian area and floodplain have been vastly impacted by that because it's just more water than the system was built to handle. And we've seen some significant down cutting of the riverbed, which kind of reduces the opportunity to take out some of the power of that water when there are flooding events, because the riparian areas just aren't built for it anymore because they don't have access to the water. And then wetland drainage is something that occurs throughout the province and throughout the agricultural area of Canada, and looking at the addition of water into these systems, as well as not having the same opportunity to treat water quality and take some of the contaminants out of these systems, which is another significant threat. So when we look at the entirety of the Qu'Appelle River Valley here in Saskatchewan, it actually crosses two ecoregions, which is quite significant when you're planning your conservation efforts because it's not the same. You can't manage it all the same. We have everything from basically just native grass prairie with very minimal tree and shrub within it at the upper reaches, to being fir, oak, aspen parkland at the more extreme lower limits of the system. So everything we consider in terms of what species are expected, exactly what our targets for conservation are, what kind of state they're in terms of their health, exactly what the threats and pressures on the system are, all of that varies from one ecoregion to another, and to a lesser extent even within those ecoregions. And for that reason, this valley actually crosses two of our planning units. In the moist mixed grassland, which is the part on the left there that the Qu'Appelle Valley is, we kind of have our upper Qu'Appelle area, which takes more than just the valley into account. It takes more of the whole watershed within that ecoregion. And at the lower limit, we've got our East Parklands, which includes this watershed as well as a large chunk of the Assiniboine River watershed. But just throwing this slide in there to show that that context varies even within this system that has kind of some concerted efforts for conservation. Just to touch on a couple of our recent acquisitions that are within the Qu'Appelle Valley and some of their importance to conservation. And the first one that's pictured here is our Valley View property. This is located a little ways down Highway 99 east of Craven. It's only about 335 acres in size, so it's not massive. It doesn't compare to some of the properties Sarah was talking about where we're doing some of the long-term bird work like OMB and Wideview and Hole in the Wall. But it's still quite significant, and it's in an area of the province where the pressures are quite high. This is located, I think, about a mile away from the closest acreage development, and there are parts of this property that would be quite well suited to that type of development in the future. We have native prairie here existing on the slopes, as you can see here, but it also has some native prairie existing on the tablelands above the valley slopes, which is becoming quite unusual to have happen. A lot of that tableland has been cultivated, and what hasn't been, a lot of it's been developed for other uses, especially, you know, cultivation and acreage development in those areas, because the vistas you get from those vantage points are quite incredible. This is a property where we have some pretty significant bird activity, and we'll be doing some better surveys down the road to improve our knowledge of that. Over the course of the summer, we've spent a lot of time doing a baseline inventory to get a good accounting of exactly the condition of all of the targets, looking at the range health of the grassland, what's there for species. So we'll be kind of compiling all that data throughout the fall and working on a property management plan, and using that baseline information to help us determine what the exact management of the property is going to be, how best we can use grazing to achieve some of our conservation targets, as well as what kind of infrastructure we might need to install on the property or to remove, because this does have an old yard site. The interesting factor there is that it's full of barn swallows, so we have to take that into account when considering how to deal with some of that infrastructure that does exist. That some of it serves as a habitat feature for a species at risk. The other property that we've recently acquired in the Qu'Appelle Valley, and these are both over the course of the past year. This is our Pascal Lake property. It's not along the lake itself. It's actually just upstream of the lake, adjacent to the marsh area along the river. It's about 285 acres in size. So again, it's not a huge property. The Pascal Lake is extremely popular for recreation. And at this current time, I don't think there's a huge ton of threat in terms of people developing along this piece. But I think that could change in 10, 20 years. So the protection of this land now will be significant down the road in terms of maintaining the connectivity. So just to provide a little bit of context, you can see there in the right-hand side, you're looking over the lake. This is kind of across the river from the Muscopetang and Pasqua First Nations. And it, you know, ties in extremely well with some existing habitat. This property, we've got, again, several species using it. We found smooth green snake here. We've got a pretty good diversity of grassland birds and wetland birds using the marsh. This is a property where Bird Studies Canada had set up some recorders to see exactly what is there for bird activity. So we'll be factoring that information and that data into our property management planning, as well as kind of serving to benefit the breeding bird atlas in terms of understanding what's there for species across the province. Here again, we're working on compiling all of our data that's been collected over the course of this past summer to help, you know, get a really good understanding of the baseline conditions of the property. Both of these properties I've mentioned are or have been grazed throughout this summer. The grazing season's wrapping up on both. So we will be continuing to use that as a management tool, but we'll be looking at our baseline information to determine exactly what those stocking rates should look like and how best to achieve our conservation targets while also supporting, that agricultural use of the property to continue on. So I guess continue talking about our work within the Qu'Appelle Valley. Actually, Nature Conservancy of Canada's first property in the province was in the Qu'Appelle Valley. It's actually just north of Wolseley. That was way back in 1982, and the property was then transferred to the provincial government after that. So we don't currently own it anymore, but it kind of looks back at that history of the importance of the valley and NCC's work within it. Across the entirety of the property here, we own and manage about 6,700 acres. So those are the lands that we have full title to or shared title, that we have direct management control. We are working on exactly what the grazing management plans will be like. We're working towards restoration in some cases. And then on top of that, 6,700 acres that we own ourselves, we have an additional 2,100 acres, or just shy of 2,100 acres, that have been conserved through conservation easement. So what that means, if anybody doesn't know, conservation easements are a tool where a landowner continues to own and manage the land, but a land trust such as NCC would register an easement on the land title that would basically indicate certain things that can't occur. So native prairie that couldn't be plowed up, wetlands couldn't be drained, you couldn't have subdivision for several acreages on those properties. Essentially, the tool is in place to continue the management that has been on the land and is compatible with conservation into the future. So like I said, there are about 2,100 acres protected under conservation easement within the valley. And then obviously several more acres. We have over 100,000 acres of conservation easement throughout the province. And the map here only shows the property that we own outright. I didn't map to show where the conservation easements are. That's something that we like to respect the privacy of those landowners as much as possible, and don't advertise where that is, because they continue to control management, the public access of those lands. The NCC lands are generally open to the public, foot access only, and basically as long as people respect our property and in terms of their use of it, we continue to manage in that way where we invite people to come and enjoy nature. There's so few opportunities in such a developed portion of the province for people that I think it's incredibly valuable to provide those connection points for people and to allow public access. So I think we talked pretty quickly and got through that pretty quickly, and I think that wraps up everything, but we've got some time for questions.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation. We do have quite a few questions here. To all of our listeners out there, if you have any more questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. Our first question is from a listener named Natalie, and she would like to know some more information regarding the nest boxes and what species were found to be using those boxes.
For sure. So we had tree swallows and house wrens using the boxes. So there was two nests, two boxes that were house wren nests, and then the other 7 boxes were tree swallows. And then the rest, I'm not sure if they were used or not, or if they were just vacant.
Thank you for that answer. A listener named Amanda would like to know what Sarah's Instagram is again, or Twitter contact information.
Sure, we will just put that up on the screen real quick.
Sure. So it's at Sarah_306.
Correct. And
Thank
it's the same
you.
on both Instagram and Twitter.
Perfect. A listener named Amanda would also like to know, how can a village that may have a significant ER designation team up with Nature Conservancy Canada? What would be the benefits, and would assistance in invasive species be possible?
So people can keep up with Nature Conservancy of Canada either by kind of paying attention, following our website, or NCC has our own kind of social media handles and that sort of thing. So on Facebook and Twitter, and I think Instagram, it's all at NCC_CNC. The last part there is the French part. In terms of providing invasive species assistance, I assume they're kind of looking for help from NCC, so I'll kind of answer the question that way. We do have some staff who have some knowledge and expertise and experience in that regard in terms of talking about what the options are and things like that. We're happy as much as we're able to meet up with people and discuss those sorts of things. But sometimes it can be, people are spread pretty thin, but we do try to meet and talk with people about those things as much as possible. There's contact information for our regional staff on our website, natureconservancy.ca, that you can get in touch with us directly. We're not able to provide any financial assistance for invasive species control at this point. We just don't have the funding to help support that. But there might be instances where we can maybe point you in the right direction, because programs like CAP, which is the new version of Growing Forward, do have some opportunities for funding to help support certain groups of species. So hopefully that answers the question.
I believe it does. Thank you. Our next question is also related to invasive species. There's a listener that would like to know, what does NCC do on your land for invasive species in terms of protection and eradication?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's quite variable depending on the property and the need. So we do monitor all of our lands annually. The lands that we own outright, we map all of those patches. The control efforts are very depending on the need. On some of our restoration projects, mowing is one of the first steps that will be undertaken. The conservation volunteer program is very helpful in that way. So if you have an interest in helping out, we often have events such as at Prairie Hill, which is in the valley just north of Regina, cutting down burdock and collecting the seeds, and then other volunteer events elsewhere. Some of the instances where we have invasive species, they're at a point where we do have to consider chemical control. So a number of our staff have been trained and are licensed as pesticide applicators, so that we can conduct kind of patch spraying of things like leafy spurge on our properties. So that's something that we've focused a lot on the last couple of years, is some of those patches of leafy spurge and trying to help prevent the spread of them. So it's kind of a really broad outlook, and it depends on the context, but we try to keep a very close eye on those invasive species and target our control efforts depending on the property and the conditions there.
Thank you for that answer. What is NCC's policy on barn swallows?
Can you be more specific? Like, what do you mean?
I guess if our listener who wrote in there could type it a little bit more, that'd be great. It looks like in terms of like infrastructure, you touched on infrastructure removal and having to be careful around barn swallows.
Yeah, so I'll touch on that a little bit, and then we'll see if Sarah corrects me, because she's smarter at birds than me. I wouldn't say we have a policy per se. A big part of our mandate at NCC is managing habitat and managing for the benefit of species at risk, which barn swallows do fall in that category. So we don't have a policy per se. However, if we are aware that barn swallows are using a certain abandoned building or something like that, we're not going to be jumping to any kind of removal effort, because we want to keep that habitat feature there. if we have abandoned infrastructure that's not being used, for liability reasons, we might look at removing that. But anytime we know of infrastructure that barn swallows are actively using, we would want to have some sort of a plan in place as replacement habitat, and make sure that replacement habitat is actually being used before we did any kind of demolishing of an old house or something like that. So it's not necessarily a policy, but we're very cognizant of the fact that our actions could have an impact on that species, and would want to have a plan in place so that it's not a negative impact before we did anything.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer. And the last question that we have right now is a listener would like to know if a person needs permission to access NCC lands, or if they can just go whenever they'd like by foot.
So I guess it depends a little bit based on how those lands are going to be used. Generally, we don't require people to ask for permission. If your intent is to just go out on the property for a bit of a hike and enjoy nature, kind of a leave no trace type of thing, we don't require any kind of permission for that at all. So if you know that lands are owned by NCC, you're welcome to go out there and do that and just respect the land. We do allow hunting on the majority of our lands in the province, and we do ask that people request permission prior to accessing the lands for that purpose. And we also don't really allow any kind of collecting of material and that sort of thing on our lands unless there's certain situations where we would want to allow that. So if there's anything like that people would want to do, we would ask for you to get in touch. But if you just want to go for a hike and enjoy the property, people are welcome to do that without getting in touch with us first.
But in terms of hunting or foraging, a person would need written permission ahead of time. That's
right, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that answer. That looks like all the questions that we have at the moment. So I guess with that, I would like to thank you both for the awesome presentation today. It was really informative. To all of our listeners out there, I personally had a chance to get out to NCC's land, the Wideview property, as part of the volunteer program, and I would highly recommend anyone interested in the conservation field to look into the NCC volunteer programs. There's lots of opportunities, and it's really simple. Click, and you're registered, and you can spend a day out in the field on beautiful native prairie. So, yeah, I would just like to take a moment to thank our sponsors again. I will pull up our screen here. Perfect. So I'd just like to thank Environment and Climate Change Canada, Eco-Friendly Saskatchewan, TransCanada Corporation, Information Services Corporation, SaskTel, Rancher Stewardship Alliance, Wildlife Habitat Canada, CanNorth, for their financial support for our Native Prairie Speaker Series, and of course, Nature Conservancy Canada for presenting today. So with that, I guess I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and have a great day. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Cameron.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye.